Good morning, good afternoon for those of you who are in a non-European time zone. We're very happy that so many of you have joined us today for the webinar on FuelEU Maritime and its implication for international shipping's decarbonization. I would also like to thank our co-organizers from Transport Environment, here represented by Faig Abbasov, the director of the shipping program, as well as Alex Springer, sustainable shipping analyst, and we'll hear from them shortly. And I would also like to thank our panelists for joining the session. So we have Ricardo Batista from the European Commission, Papoutsis from Euronav, and Lannoy from the hydrogen business unit at ENGIE. We'll hear more from them afterwards. My name is Kasper Søgaard. I'm a managing director at the Global Maritime Forum, and I will be moderating today's session, which you might actually have already realized that this is my role. And first of all, I would also like to thank all of you for joining. I think this will be a really good discussion, and I hope many of you will be willing to post your questions in the chat so we can have a rich debate and really get answers to the questions that are most pressing for you. Let me just start by introducing the Getting to Zero Coalition. The Getting to Zero Coalition was launched in 2019 at the UN Climate Action Summit, where we had around 50 companies unite around the goal to have commercially viable zero-emission ships in deep sea operation by 2030, supported by the necessary fuel production and bunkering infrastructure. I was in New York at the General Assembly when it was launched, and I remember a lot of the dialogues that we had with people from the maritime industry at the time, and many told us having zero-emission shipping in operation by 2030 was a pipe dream. This would never happen. It was impossible. And I think now, looking back, it's only been 4 years, and looking at the amount of projects that are ongoing, investments in both ships, technology, fuel production, I think everyone should be really proud of the great progress that has been made. But I think it was also very clear that this momentum and this work is not because it's easy. So today the coalition counts over 200 members, and we've also set a target of having full decarbonization by 2050 to align with the goals that we need to have shipping also be part of that global energy transition. And we've also set some short-term targets, because following the discussions in 2019, where people said having just a single commercial viable zero-emission shipping in operation by 2030 was too ambitious, a couple of years in, people said, oh, that's actually not ambitious enough. We really need to reach a tipping point by 2030 where we will have enough ships running on the zero-emission fuels to really reach that zero in 2050 goal. So we set a goal of reaching 5% scalable zero-emission fuel use in 2030, and because this can help unlock the necessary investments, reduce costs, and build the confidence that issues around safety, bunkering, all of those things can be dealt with, and really have that market-driven offtake of these fuels. It was also quite clear in the discussions in the Getting to Zero Coalition, and I think these mirror a lot of discussions that are happening elsewhere. So it's not just our finding, but basically a key conclusion was the fact that if we are to reach the 5% goal, if we are to make zero-emission shipping commercially viable, we would need policy support, because otherwise the price gap between the fossil fuels and the new fuels would never be overcome, and there wouldn't be a business case. I think we strongly believe that to have the transition, it needs to make sense also economically for companies. So it was clear also from the discussion in the Getting to Zero Coalition that the ideal would be to have global regulation adopted at the IMO. And I think a lot of us are putting hope that the IMO at the MEPC 80 in July will make a significant step forward in sending that signal to the market that the transition is happening also at the global level. But it was also realized that regional policy can play an important role, especially in the beginning of this transition. And I think it's fair to say that the EU, with the Fit for 55 package and the shipping files in it, has really taken the mantle of being a global leader in shipping decarbonization. And I think the various elements are giving a strong signal to both the industry, but also to the IMO and other countries that this is happening, and that to reduce emissions from shipping activities is important, and that there are also clear spillovers into the desire to build up the hydrogen economy. I think the policy framework set by the EU have been a useful step in achieving these targets, and I think today we'll be focusing especially on FuelEU Maritime, because I think this is a policy framework that is sending a signal to industry that the transition will happen, and it will hopefully stimulate demand signals for scalable zero-emission fuels and building confidence in both fuel suppliers and users. Today we'll really deep dive into this to get an understanding of what will this actually mean in practice. What are the business decisions and considerations actors in the shipping industry should look at when they think about how they respond to these things. And also, and I think this is especially in the panel, deep dive into some of the uncertainties, some of the things where there's still a need for more clarity and maybe for some improvement in the implementation phase. So really understanding what will this mean in practice and how can we use this to make progress on shipping decarbonization. Again, I encourage you to post your messages in the chat and your questions. We have Lau facilitating the moderation. Those questions that we won't have time to answer today, we will make sure that you get an answer to it. So please don't hesitate to put in your questions. Also, just wanted to inform you that the webinar will be recorded and shared on the Global Maritime Forum YouTube channel. So if you have a colleague that you think should really see this, there will be an opportunity to revisit it afterwards. And we will also be sharing the slides that are being used today with you afterwards. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And now, without further ado, I'll turn the call over to Faig and Alex. Faig Abbasov is the director of the shipping program at Transport Environment, Brussels-based sustainable transport group advocating for sustainable transport policies in the EU and globally. Faig holds a PhD in European energy policy and is trained in ship energy efficiency. Also very happy to have Alex Springer. He's a sustainable shipping analyst at Transport Environment. Before this, Alex worked for several years for a data intelligence provider within the shipping industry, where he specialized in areas including environmental regulation and shipbuilding markets. His work at Transport Environment focuses on maritime emissions, policy analysis, and sustainable marine fuels. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and hello to all. Can you please give me a sign if you hear me all right? Okay, I see people nodding. Yes, today we'll be talking about two of the fuel legislations that was adopted as part of the EU Fit for 55 package. I want to quickly share my screen. Please do let me know if you see what's on the screen. Perfect. I'm hoping to speak no more than 4 or 5 minutes today, because what we will present today is our analysis, a source of impact assessment from our perspective on what we have achieved as part of the Fit for 55 package. As you know, the package has a suite of legislations. You can imagine those as kind of a different pieces of the puzzle. You have the demand and generation regulation of FuelEU Maritime. You have the carbon pricing in part in the form of ETS. There's a supply side regulation, the Renewable Energy Directive, and there's a infrastructure regulation, that's AFIR, short for Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, and the whole thing is impacted by the existing, but also to be revised taxonomy rules, sustainable finance rules at the EU level. Today, we will talk about only 2 of those. Not because others are not important, but because of you will need to have an entire day to spend in going into details and impact assess those. One thing we realized, and I want to also refer to what Kasper said earlier on. There's a Getting to Zero coalition has set an aspirational goal of reaching at least 5% of sustainable and scalable near zero emission fuels by 2030. I mean, at the heart of it is the understanding that to decarbonize shipping, among others, we need to switch to sustainable fuels. And one thing the industry and the policymakers have realized that because of the price gap between the dirty and clean fuels, this process will not happen on its own. We'll need to have regulations, among others, to help create those demand signals, as Kasper mentioned. And the heart of the FuelEU Maritime regulation is actually that, to create those demand signals to incentivize the fuel suppliers to put their investments in place and produce those fuels. So today's presentation, that Alex will present later on, will be exactly on how we can forecast fuel demand for different types of fuels as a result of the regulatory levers in the form of FuelEU Maritime and in ETS. But before we go into our projected fuel mix, I would like to kind of provide an overview in terms of overall emission reductions that we can expect to be associated with the Fit for 55 package. First of all, and I also want to put it in the context of the SBTI, that stands for Science-Based Target Initiatives. that has been developed and also proposed to the IMO and supported by many countries. If we apply those science-based target initiative at the EU level, how would the emissions savings associated with FuelEU as well as ETS compare to that trajectory? First thing to note is that EU legislation will have significant impact on emission reductions, and those emission reductions are in a way guaranteed. But one thing kind of also pops to eye is that those emission reductions are at this stage nowhere near the science-based target initiative endorsed pathway. One thing that does not is not visible in this graph is the impact of exemptions as part of the European legislation. For example, European legislation does not cover emissions from smaller vessels, but we could already add those emissions into a chart like this and kind of help to visualize the total emissions savings associated with 55. What we can see is that as we broaden the scope of the European legislation, we'll need to increase the ambition down the line. And then there is another question that EU legislation covers only 50% of the international voyages, because the other 50% is expected to be tackled by other countries. Then a question might be asked that if other countries did not live up to this expectation and EU might have to regulate those emissions, how would it look like in the context of SBTi compliant curve? So this is kind of to set the scene in terms of what we have achieved and the gaps left behind as a food for thought for the future revisions of European legislations going forward. One thing I would like to quickly touch upon is ETS, carbon pricing. We have been a strong advocate of carbon pricing for shipping, especially at the EU level, but we are also one of the first ones to also highlight that even though ETS is an ambitious piece of legislation, the carbon price signal from the ETS is not strong enough to bridge the price gap between clean and dirty fuels. For that reason, FuelEU Maritime is such an essential piece of legislation that we're happy that was adopted at the EU level. FuelEU Maritime, in short, FEUM. I just want to clarify the acronym because you will see it down the line. When we talk about FuelEU Maritime, this slide usually comes pops up the overall emissions reduction pathway, as well as the zero-emission berth standard, so to speak, that is mandated by this legislation. But FuelEU Maritime is actually a very complex piece of legislation. It's extremely complex, and we want to do analysis of taking into account different elements in this legislation, as well as the impact from the ETS, what kind of demand for different alternative fuels we can expect. And to do that, we realized that our existing tools, modeling tools, were not fit for purpose. I tried to kind of summarize all the political levers as well as the commercial considerations that individual companies, whether at the ship level or at the fleet level, will need to take into account. There's an overall GHG emission standards, then there is a mechanism to incentivize certain fuels, for example, RFMBO multiplier of 2. There is a sub-quota for RFMBO. There's a pooling mechanism in the system. There's an ETS price coming from the side, shoreside electricity mandate, which, by the way, also affects the achievement of the overall targets. So all those levers are actually connected to each other. And add to that the fleet composition today and the evolution going forward, as well as the impact of the fuel prices going forward. Some fuels will be cheaper, some fuels will be expensive, other fuels will remain stable. How all of this will generate demand for different types of fuels. And that's to analyze this, we built in-house techno-economic equilibrium model, and we applied it to container fleet. And I think this is the right time for me to pass the floor to my colleague, Alex, who built this model to present initially the model, but also the results. I want to clarify one thing, though. This analysis is not about our preferred pathway, preferred fuel mix for European shipping. And this is also not about the supply side at the EU level. What we are analyzing and presenting today is if shipping companies were to act rationally in complying with the European legislation to minimize their costs, what kind of behavior we can expect from them? As a result, what kind of fuel uptake we can expect? And what would it mean to fuel mix going forward? I think this is the right time for me to turn it over to Alex. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Faig. I'll just share my screen myself so that I can control the slides. Thank you. Can everyone see that okay? Signal, cheers. Yeah, so first I'll take you through what exactly the modeling exercise that we've done involves, and then try and explain some of the results we've got out of it. So as you will have seen from Faig's last slide, there are a huge amount of different options and factors that come into play here. There are lots of different aspects to the regulation. There are lots of costs that shipping companies have to take into account. So we tried to build a model that would basically take all of those inputs and then optimize the choices that the container ship operators are making in order to tell us, what should be the fuel demand and what kind of technologies will ships be using. So what the model does is it takes a number of inputs, which include fuel prices from a range of sources, which include ETS prices, the cost of new ships. That also includes, the different regulation inputs from the FuelEU Maritime that we talked about in the last slide. That's the intensity targets, the subquota, the multiplier, and the shoreside electricity mandate. And then we've also modeled, projected fuel demand. So how much fuel do ships need in each period, and how can they meet that within the constraints of the regulation? So the model takes all of those constraints and then tries to minimize each shipping operator's fuel costs and new building costs while meeting all of those. And what it does is it outputs a fleet technology mix. So every part of the fleet can either use one of 4 technologies which we've selected, either fuel oil, so the conventionally fueled ships that we know, LNG dual fuel, methanol dual fuel, or ammonia dual fuel. And then within those technologies, ships can use a mix of fuels. So it can be that, for example, you have a methanol ship built, but it uses VLSFO at first, then switches to biomethanol, and then switches to e-methanol later in our kind of model period. Just to go over those technologies, we tried to keep things relatively simple to make sure that we weren't covering dozens of technologies and different options that may or may not become available. So we focused on kind of 4 technology options and 9 different fuels. Those with the most kind of potential, and also with available pricing data, so that we weren't modeling this in the dark. So within each technology that exists in the model, there's a subset of fuels. All of them can use VLSFO. LNG ships, of course, can use fossil LNG as well. And then each of those, apart from ammonia, has a biofuel option and an e-fuels option as well. So for the start of this modeling process, we also took into account, what are the current technologies in the fleet in the order book, and that includes recent orders for LNG and methanol ships. So essentially, the main output of the model is trying to figure out what technologies and what fuels are going to be used by container ships going forward. Should state as well, we focused on the container ship sector because we think that the pooling mechanism in the FuelEU Maritime is most kind of easily applicable within that sector, where, for example, you have lots of liner companies that are both owning and operating their ships. So we've taken the assumption that all of those operators will pool their emissions within themselves rather than sharing between. In other sectors where you have, more market disaggregation, you might have owners pooling between vessels, or you might have more difficulty in operating that pooling mechanism, and so perhaps more owners just switching fuels within their own fleets. So just to give a quick summary of the scenarios that are included in this presentation, I should outline as well that there's a kind of more detailed full report coming from this as well. All of this will be included in more detail, and we'll be summarizing these scenarios and more scenarios in a bit more detail in that report, which is coming out in a few weeks. But just to summarize what we're doing today, In our kind of business as usual scenario, we have no constraints from EU regulation, base case pricing, which we used a range of sources to come up with what we think are reasonable prices for fuels across the period, minimal shoreside electricity, and no EU ETS. So that's a kind of business as usual, or basically a no regulation kind of scenario. Then the next scenario, which is the one we worked at in the most detail, is our base case scenario for the final FuelEU agreement. So that takes all of the emissions intensity targets, the sub-quota, the multiplier, as per the final agreement that we discussed. And then again takes our kind of base case fuel prices and uses the IEA's recent World Energy Outlook to get some carbon prices for the ETS. And then basically tells us, based on this final agreement that's happened, what do we think fuel demand is going to be across the sector? The next one that I'll cover very briefly is one where we have all of that as in the final FuelEU scenario, but also we have late feasibility of ammonia. So all as above, except we only have ammonia feasibility from 2040, and we have lower e-methanol prices. Part of what we wanted to try and do there is capture, why exactly are some operators going for methanol already? You'll see from the results, e-ammonia is generally expected to be the cheapest e-fuel, and probably going to have plenty of uptake later on. So why would ships go for e-methanol now? We've tried to provide some kind of rationale for that within our model. Then I'll also turn later on to two SBTi compliant scenarios. So scenarios within our modeling which meet the SBTi compliant trajectories for 1.5 degree compliant shipping emissions. The first of those is achieved just using the fuel mix in the model. So what kind of transformation do we need from current fuels to biofuels and e-fuels to meet that target? And then in the second, we'll take a quick look at what does that mean in terms of also factoring in fuel demand or efficiency as well. So to briefly cover what would be our main kind of results from our FuelEU Maritime final agreement scenario. The first graph here shows the fuel mix from 2025 at the start of the period when the regulation comes into place up to the 2050s when the final targets that are currently in place come into effect. So there's a number of interesting findings from this. Some things which we think are kind of ideas for improvement in the regulation, other things which we think are big positives. Firstly, one thing to look at is that FuelEU still allows ships to burn some VLSFO and definitely some LNG into the 2050s. So we think that if fuel demand plays out as we expect, there'll be a significant number of LNG technology ships that are still using LNG fuel in the 2050s. One positive, if it's technically feasible as we have it here, e-ammonia should see the biggest demand from new ships from 2040 onwards. So really, once those targets start kicking in, e-ammonia takes over as the kind of fuel of choice for new ships in the shipping industry. In this case, limited demand for biofuels, but we'll see that can vary depending on the scenario. And really, one thing that we'd highlight about the regulation here is that LNG still remains the main option for early switching in the 2025, 2030, even late 2030s period. Ships can still switch to LNG and be compliant, which we think is a level of ambition that can be improved. So just touching on that scenario I mentioned where the feasibility of ammonia engines is delayed. In this case, we'd expect to see a bit of a higher uptake of methanol technology ships. Again, though, wherever e-ammonia becomes available in our modeling, what the optimization kind of indicates is that ships will go for it as soon as it becomes available. So in this case, where you have e-ammonia becoming available into the 2040s, new ships generally tend to switch towards doing that. So we think that with the kind of costs considered, if ammonia becomes available, that becomes the sort of e-fuel of choice for complying with FuelEU Maritime. Again, regardless of that, LNG is still the kind of main option for switching in the early years. So we think there's a clear issue of significant demand for fossil LNG throughout our kind of model period. Another thing that kind of comes out of the model is that we can, look at total container ship emissions. What happens here is that because you still have growing fuel demand in our base case, and the targets are not necessarily particularly strict until the late 2030s, even the 2040s, annual emissions potentially won't peak for another 10 to 15 years because we've still got a growing container ship order book. We've still got a growing fleet and potentially more container ship emissions. The fuel intensity of improvements that are required by FuelEU Maritime aren't particularly strict for a while. So essentially that total emissions is we think potentially flatlining for a number of periods. And it doesn't really start to fall until the 2040s when some more significant targets come in. So we'll kind of cover, we looked earlier at, why that might not be compliant with, 1.5 degree sort of level of ambition. In terms of the RFNBOs, so that's renewable fuels of non-biological origin, we think these are the kind of key mechanism for, improving shipping sustainability, for getting to net zero, for, really introducing sustainable fuels into shipping. We're expecting these to become the main kind of price competitive way of, lowering emissions in line with the FuelEU Maritime in 2035 or 2040. That's as potentially e-fuels should become cheaper over time while biofuels become more expensive given the constraints to the kind of availability constraints. What happens here in the model is that where you have ammonia available, you actually have uptake of potentially 6% from 2035, actually moving beyond the beyond what's required in the final regulation in the RFNBO subquota. But it's worth noting that the brown line that you can see in 2035 just below, if you have any kind of delay to ammonia engines, that could negatively impact the share of RFNBOs, because as we see it in the modeling, there aren't any other e-fuels that are potentially as competitive as e-ammonia. So if ships have to switch to others, potentially they're only going to do as much as they have to do to meet the subquota. And again, it's worth pointing out the importance of that subquota. If e-fuels aren't available at as low prices as they potentially could be, if ammonia fuel is scaled up, the subquota is what starts pushing that adoption. So it's a really important demand mechanism. Another thing we can get out of the model is various costs. So this slide looks at what are the annual costs in each period. Firstly, the kind of business as usual costs with no ETS, and then also the potential extra costs from the regulation. So it's worth, you can see in the first few periods, the ETS cost is the main thing that's factored in. That's particularly as ships pay more ETS costs on VLSFO and LNG that they use. Later on, it's the cost of complying with FuelEU Maritime that start to increase. So really, it's only once those targets become more strict in the 2040s that the cost of complying with the regulation really starts to increase. We don't think it has much of an impact for quite some time. Again, I should note as well that not all costs are included here. So companies that are operating ships face lots of other costs, port fees, maintenance, container handling, and so on, which aren't covered here. So it's worth being clear that this is only the costs that are included in the model. We don't think that FuelEU is going to lead to a doubling of costs, because there are other costs here that are kind of consistent between scenarios. So this is just a summary of the costs that are relevant to our modeling exercise. Again, just showing here how that breaks down for owners. Fuel costs, are still going to make up the majority of costs in every period, but the ETS costs are quite significant earlier in the period as well. So although these don't necessarily have a huge impact on fuel choices, ETS costs will impact owners, and they do create a significant potential volume of funds that can be used for decarbonization projects and so on. What we did here as well is just to note that if you look at how costs stack up in terms of on a per TEU basis, the increase throughout the model isn't actually hugely significant. We do have a bit of an increase later on in the period as operators switch to different fuels. But a lot of this increase is partly due to the fuel demand that's growing throughout the period. There's actually an initial decline in the first couple of periods because we think in the model that LNG prices could potentially slow down. I can't cover this in too much detail, but I'll just move on to the kind of final exercise we did as part of this that I think is interesting to show. What we wanted to do was compare, what's been implemented in the regulation with what would be required for a 1.5 degree compliant shipping pathway. And I think it shows that even though, it's a real step forward to get these kind of intensity targets included and to get fuel switching really being incentivized as part of a regulation, there's still a long way to go for shipping regulation to really be compliant with 1.5 degrees. So on the left-hand side, we've shown a kind of S-curve trajectory, which is compatible with SBTI, which is the green line on the left hand. So in order to implement, that kind of trajectory, we need what's estimated to be a 36% cut in emissions by 2030 and a 96% cut by 2040. So effectively, you would need almost full decarbonization into the 2040s to achieve this. For reference, I've also compared that to what is the EU currently proposing at the IMO. That's just slightly short of the S-curve compliant, the SBTI compliant targets, which some other parties have proposed. But really, there's a much greater level of ambition, we think, in the EU's current proposals to the IMO than what we're seeing in the EU's regulation itself. So we've plotted on the left-hand side to compare with that, what are the actual emissions that that come out in the modelling from the FuelEU Maritime, because we think demand is going to grow in this sector. And again, you could apply that differently to different sectors of shipping. Emissions actually aren't really going down until the 2040s, whereas according to the trajectories that you need to have almost full decarbonisation by that point. On the right, we've kind of plotted out what that would mean for the FuelEU Maritime, and you can see just how much the level of ambition would really need to increase to meet that 1.5 degree compliant target. Again, this isn't about what is feasible or likely. This is about just showing the gap between what's in the regulation at the moment and what would really be needed to get emissions on the most optimistic possible trajectory. So what we did here was, once we converted those into FuelEU Maritime equivalent targets, we looked at what would be the optimal choices for owners. If you do that from a purely fuels perspective, as we have here, you're talking about extremely rapid switching in each period, probably a currently unavailable or unsustainable volume of biofuels being needed in the early period to meet fuel demand, and then a very significant switch over to e-fuels needed from 2035. Again, this is just a kind of illustrative exercise to show the huge transformations that would be needed to keep shipping on a 1.5 degree compliant path. There's a huge amount that would need to be done. However, we've started to model kind of scenarios for how that could be achieved through other measures as well. Of course, it's not necessarily just going to happen through fuels if we increase the level of ambition. If you have lower demand growth, if you have improved energy efficiency, that might be something that starts to become more achievable. And I think, as we work going forward, we'll be looking at more scenarios and more detail for how shipping can tackle those kind of targets without just needing such rapid fuel switching. Worth pointing out again that as soon as you have these 1.5 degree compliant scenarios, LNG has a very limited role. You can't decarbonize quickly while switching to LNG across the 2030s, and that's the point we want to make fairly clear. So I'll pass back to Faig now. If you're happy to talk over my screen sharing, Faig, then I'll let you step in with the kind of recommendations that we're interested in here.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yes, I think we can keep this slide on. I'll be very brief. So we as part of this exercise, which we will publish, by the way, on the 26th of June, we would like to give certain recommendations to the policymakers, and those recommendations are grouped into two sections. Basically, what the European policymakers, as well as at the national level, should be doing to successfully implement FuelEU Maritime, because now we have adopted it. but its impact will depend on its successful implementation. And we wanted to kind of draw attention to some of the key elements that might not have gathered enough media attention, especially on the supply side of the Fit for 55 package. There is a renewable energy directive that sets indicative, non-binding supply target for marine RFMBOs at European ports. Now it's up to individual member states whether to put it into effect or not. So we think this is an essential element that member states can draw from the Fit for 55 and implement at the national level. There are also requirements on developing national plans on some of the RFMBO bunkering infrastructure. So the mandate is not about putting in place the infrastructure, but developing plans about those under alternative fuels infrastructure regulation. And we strongly encourage member states to follow through on that. The same on the shoreside electricity, additional measures they can take to decarbonize smaller vessels, and then ultimately contracts for difference, basically revenues that will be that will be raised as part of both the ETS as well as FuelEU Maritime, that can be used to help subsidize initial deployments of high potential but expensive technologies in the near future. I don't want to go too much into detail because with getting to Zero Coalition, we have another webinar coming up. So I strongly invite you all to join it in the coming weeks. But we also have some initial recommendations for the next European Commission, the next legislature, and that includes obviously increasing the targets at the overall level for FuelEU Maritime to align them with the Science Based Target Initiative, but also setting higher RFMBO subquotas. And there are recommendations in relation to bunkering infrastructure, supply targets, but also thinking about holistically, because this last slide from Alex was very informative, that if we rely only on the fuel switch, we'll have a hard time in decarbonizing the sector. We need to think about to reduce the demand for marine fuels through improved energy efficiency, but also thinking about demand reduction or lower demand growth in the mid and long term, because those will be essential to make this transition manageable and less disruptive for the industry. That's all from our side. Many thanks, and looking forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Faig and Alex. I think a lot of information to digest. I can also see from the activity in the chat that it raises a lot of questions. I can see you already started answering some of the more technical questions, so please continue doing that. But there are a couple of things that I just wanted to raise while we still have you in terms of this. So you made this modeling based on container shipping. Have you looked at whether your findings would be similar if you looked at other sectors, or is this container industry specific? Because of course, and a lot of the Getting to Zero Coalition members are not only doing container shipping, or might be doing other things.
I could quickly start replying, and Alex, please do chime in. I mean, there were two reasons why we initially started with container shipping. Firstly, model is very, very complex. And because of the diversity in the industry, we felt like it would take us too much time to build an over-encompassing model. It doesn't mean that other sectors are not important; they are essential. But we decided to take it into two steps. And in terms of whether this will be one-to-one applicable to the rest of the sectors, perhaps Alex, you're a better place to answer this question.
Yeah, if I can answer as well. We haven't necessarily done a direct exercise of, what exactly do we think will happen in other sectors yet. We think that's something for our next step, but you could certainly model other sectors in the same way. We just felt that it was most realistic to model the container ships in this way to start with. So in other sectors where you have, for example, more differences between owners and charterers, so who's operating the ship, where you have more tramp shipping, so ships that don't necessarily know where they're going to operate, there's more uncertainty around the fuel choice, and I think it's probably more difficult to make those investment decisions up front than it is in the container ship sector. So it's certainly something we want to do for a next step, but I think we probably need have a bit of a deeper look into, into the market dynamics in those sectors before we feel we can really do that, realistically. Because there are so many aspects of the regulation, in particular the pooling, for example, which become more and more difficult the more complex and the more divergent the sector.
Thank you. It is indeed complex, and I think especially the ones that are having to make the investment decisions today with kind of the uncertainty around how the market develops, the state of the technology. I think one kind of takeaway I had, but I want to pose it as a question just to see if I understood you correctly. So with the current version of FuelEU Maritime, is really when we get into the 2040s that it really starts to bite, and when we see a dramatic uptake and a dramatic shift in the ship technology. But I think you also raised, and Faig, I think in some of your recommendations to policymakers, which of course is Transport Environment's recommendation, you raised the perspective that the current targets are not aligned with what the EU has been proposing to the IMO, what would be required to align with a 1.5 compliant trajectory. Which could lead, or I guess that's a question, like, do you see a significant, and I think depending on your point of view, risk or kind of opportunity for a strengthening of the requirements under FuelEU Maritime, and at what point would that likely to take place? Because again, I think we're planning for an uncertain future. So how do you see those kind of processes play out?
I mean, my short answer will be that FuelEU Maritime has a review clause built into it. So does the ETS, and the opportunity to review and revise both ETS as well as FuelEU Maritime will present itself in the next European legislative cycle. Obviously, we have European elections next year. And we're hoping that the ambition of the next Commission and Member States and the European Parliament will match, if not surpass, the ambition of this Commission. Obviously, we're talking about at the political level. We're not talking about the individual, the experts like Ricardo and others. Obviously, their ambition is not questioned here. Once we have the high ambition in the next European legislative cycle, will be hopefully take advantage of this new knowledge, new data, and increase the target. That being said, there's nothing that prevents member states to go beyond European legislation and do some extra steps. And that's one of the reasons that we recommended that some of the ship types that have not been regulated could still be done at the national level, especially domestic shipping, and that they don't need to wait for the next European cycle.
Thank you very much. I know, Ricardo, I know you have a lot of comments on these things. I will give you the floor as soon as we transition into the panel. So I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Alex and Faig for really thought-provoking presentation. As we've also seen in the chat, there's a lot of interest in receiving the slides. So we will share that. And Femke, if I can encourage you to also, once the report is out, and I think Faig, you said the 26th of June. Then we can also share a link to the report with participants, because I would imagine you can go a little bit more into the details around the modeling and those things. So thank you so much, and I'll say goodbye to you, Alex. But then, Faig, I'll invite you to also join the panel, so you'll be with you. So again, more questions to Faig. We're happy to take those. So in the panel discussion, Faig will be joined by Ricardo Batista. Ricardo is currently working at the European Commission's Director General for Mobility and Transport in the Maritime Transport Unit as a policy officer. Here, Richard is engaged in the development, negotiation, and preparatory work of the FuelEU Maritime regulation. So this is why we're really happy to have you. You are the expert. And prior to this, Ricardo worked at the European Maritime Safety Agency and the American Bureau of Shipping. So really deep knowledge about the shipping industry. So thank you so much for joining us today. We'll also have Kostas Papoutsis. Kostas works at Euronav, and he joined Euronav in 2021 as the company's first ever sustainability manager. Before that, he held various positions in transport sustainability in companies active in its industry, and also in research and academia. And he holds a PhD in the field of retail logistics and sustainability. Of course, very happy to have Kostas here as a representative of one of the big ship owners that will need to implement and really think about some of the implications of the new EU regulation. And also very happy to introduce Rose Lannoy. Rose is a manager of public affairs and hydrogen at ENGIE, and she has more than 20 years of experience working in climate change, particularly in this area of CO2 valorization and carbon markets. Rose is also board member of CO2 Value Europe and is active in Hydrogen Europe. And I think really, Rose, one of the things that we always hear when we speak about this transition is, will we have the fuels available to make this transition? And I think ENGIE is definitely one of the European leaders in looking into what this requires. But I think also what we understand from conversations with you and others, making those long-term big investment decisions is fraught with risk, and an understanding of where the demand side is will be critical to unlocking those business cases. So very happy to have across the full value chain. To kick us off, I know because you're, I could see in the chat, Ricardo, that you're jumping to answer some of the questions that were posed in the chat, where we had a lot of questions around carbon capture and storage, also kind of around the biofuels, and I think also some questions around what are the next steps in the implementation. So could I please invite you to answer those, to just to kick us off? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning to everyone. Many thanks for the invitation and for allowing the Commission to be in this panel. I would like to congratulate TNE for the presentation. TNE has been a great partner in the negotiations, in the development of the FuelEU Maritime, and I'm looking forward for the results of this study later this month. It is a modeling exercise which appears to present interesting results. However, like every modeling exercise, the assumptions are remarkably important to note, and I will certainly have a close look at those assumptions, because it's really interesting. Just 2 notes, and before going into the implementation exercise, Kasper, it is important to note the FuelEU Maritime is developed within the Fit for 55 legislative package, which, in line with the EU climate law, is targeted at net decarbonization of the EU economy. So it presents a contribution which cannot be compared directly with the ambition at IMO or international shipping. It is a first step, but it is important to note that the targets of the FuelEU Maritime are developed within a different context, and therefore, of course, the considerations for international shipping and IMO discussions are slightly different. Having that in mind, also the reference to RFNBO sub-target in the presentation and in the assumptions, it would be important to note that the outcome of the negotiations, it should read possible RFNBO sub-target, because it depends on how the market develops in the first years. As far as the implementation exercise is concerned, which is the one we're focused at the moment, we are developing secondary legislation. We have 15 documents to develop, covering different aspects: monitoring, reporting of data specific to FuelEU, onshore power supply, and the exchange of information for shore power. The RFNBO provisions, the RFNBO specific measures are also supported by secondary legislation, which is to be developed. So the industry, stakeholders, expert group that is working with the Commission, the European Sustainable Shipping Forum, is tasked with the development of the technical aspects for the implementation. So the industry is engaged also with us in the development of this of these elements. And there are some more technical, others more of governance related aspects, but the FuelEU as it stands will not be operable, will not be implementable, enforceable if these secondary legislation elements are not in place. So it is a time critical, time sensitive moment we're at the moment. Aspects like certification of zero-emission technologies, we're also working on that. So, and I know TNE is also particularly involved and engaged in these discussions. So it is, the negotiations period was extremely exciting and intense, but now it's time consuming and also tense in the sense that we have no time, basically. We are running against the clock. there's an angle of implementation which I would not like to forget, and which is industry cooperation, which we are promoting through the Renewable and Low Carbon Fuel Alliance. And here, fuel suppliers, operators, distributors, all stakeholders involved in the value chain of marine fuels, from production to distribution and use, we currently amount to 250 members already, also considering aviation. So it's aviation and maritime and fuel supply. The results are already extremely good, in the sense that we have demand forecasts, we have supply constraints being addressed, we have certification of greenhouse gas intensity of marine fuels, we have Europe versus global challenges being addressed. Of course, the challenges of aviation and maritime are different. But as far as maritime is concerned, there's a focus on drop-in solutions for the first years, blendable solutions for the first years. How the multiplier and the sub-target will also be integrated in ensuring early investment in production of scalable renewable fuels. So this is an angle of the implementation which is not related to the legal acts. It's an angle of the implementation related to paving the ground, to allow operators to be able to mitigate as much as possible the risk of non-complying. And it's true, the Faig, we will agree, the first targets are mild. They represent a compromise between what would be the ideal and what we consider is the adequate for the operators to continue more or less undisrupted operation, and also trying to, as you say, Faig, we already exchanged on this, it's important to prove the concept, to have this concept of the FuelEU proven, hands-on job, and we're able to, and then, as you said, revision exercise of these instruments will allow to tune and to engage in reassessing the ambition, reassessing some of the aspects of the regulation.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I've noted down a couple of things that I think is important. I think one is your work has not stopped just because the legal act has been doing. There's a lot of details in hammering out the secondary acts. And I think that will hopefully provide some of the more clarity around exactly how this is going to be implemented also for companies. So I think look out for in this space. I think the second thing that I think is very encouraging, and I think very much in line with what we try to do in the Getting to Zero Coalition, is around that stakeholder engagement, that this is not being hammered out in an ivory tower. This is actually having that input from industry, understanding what is needed, and have something that's workable in practice. And again, I will just encourage everyone who's engaged in those discussions to continue to give that input to the Commission, so that we get something that is practical also in practice. And I think that your third point is this is a proof of concept. We need to see that if it works in practice, then there might be room again for revising. And I would imagine, given the climate debate in Europe, probably revising the ambition in an upward direction if we can get this to work, if the fuels are there, if the technologies are there. So again, I think something to look out for. Now I'll turn to you, Kostas, because your company, Euronav, you will have to find a strategy for how to respond to this. So how do you see, what are the implications FuelEU Maritime will have as a ship owner operator?
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot, Kasper, Faig, and teams for having me here today. So undoubtedly, the policy framework, the FuelEU Maritime policy framework, it is in the right direction. Again, it demonstrates the EU's, let's say, leadership in moving the needle to accelerate the effort for shipping decarbonization, at least within EU territories, and hopefully beyond. Indeed, it drives the energy transition, providing those so-called and long-awaited fuel standards. Indeed, also it provides signals for demand, but also its implications can also provide some stimulus for the fuel supply, which is more clearly articulated within the Renewable Energy Directive. And finally, it provides an effort to support the end-to-end, let's say, decarbonization, end-to-end voyage decarbonization outcome, starting from the laden, ballast, also part of the voyage, but also covering the berth emissions as well. However, as every policy framework, there are specific implications, and especially for for the ship owners, and not only as a group, but also cascading down to different shipping segments of the ship owners. As very well alluded by Faig and Alex previously, containers, passenger ferries are impacted kind of differently versus the dry and liquid bulk sector. Eventually, and also looking at the OPS part, the regulation is a bit more tailored for the fixed route shipping, which is passengers and containers, because they have the ability to foresee with more precisely, let's say, the exposure to EU sailing waters. On the other hand, the tanker and the dry bulk, because of their trump or spot nature, it's a bit more challenging to anticipate when the tanker will be sailing in EU waters. It's like a taxi. So as a taxi has a passenger, especially in the spot market, the taxi finds a passenger and moves them to the right direction. And then it's like the tanker sector is like using the cargo as a passenger. When there is a cargo, there's a tanker, and then it goes from loading to discharge terminal as well. On the other hand, that can impede, especially from a dry and liquid bulk, the ability to sign offtake agreements with fuel suppliers because of the aforementioned reason that it's more challenging, let's say, to anticipate sailing in EU waters and then to be able to comply with a specific regulation. However, keeping that aside, the potential offtake agreements should be signed in the context of IMO compliance and living up to our commitments to decarbonize shipping in a global level, of course. So next, there are some financial as well implications. The a bit more expensive alternative fuels or zero-emission fuels, of course, that will be also in the context of shipping decarbonization per se. But nevertheless, there are some additional costs that we can pinpoint there as a result of this regulation. Resources need to be allocated to report and monitor the new data series regarding the energy used on board, the verification, and so on. So potentially time, people, and money will need to allocate it to serving those needs. And now thinking on this potentially smaller ship owners, if they have the capacity to allocate and how much on those administrative, let's say, tasks. Additional financial implications from the OPS, onshore power supply compliance, especially for the containers and passengers that need to invest from $200,000 to $1 million and maybe more to build the right equipment on board to be able to comply with the ports that have the capacity, the need, let's say, to provide electricity or other types of zero-emission fuel technologies. And of course, the new database of the FuelEU Maritime, which will be compared with existing EU MRV, how much different that will be. Will there be kind of interconnectivity, interoperability, or how much will be the additional level of reporting and monitoring information on that one? A big one as well, Kasper and Faig and team, is the certification, as you mentioned before. If there is a fuel bunkered in Singapore, for instance, which is a very popular shipping bunkering hub, or EU or US, how this certification can be sourced? Who will be the recognized verification authorities that can release those certificates? We need to know the list of the fuels and the emission factors as well that are combining those types of fuels. So there's a bit of clarity there that would be useful to have, since the ship owners are the ones responsible to source and submit the certificates of compliance for the fuels as well. Next to the bunker delivery node data quality, which will come from different fuel suppliers around the globe. So then there is a need for more consistency there. One more is the...
Yeah, final part, Kostas?
Yes. So regarding now the opportunities that we will see also in uncertainties as well, the fact that the fuel suppliers are in the spotlight, it's actually a beauty here. Of course, a bit more implications regarding the FuelEU Maritime, but also focused on the Renewable Energy Directive. The ship owners are mainly responsible for the tank-to-wake emissions, co-responsible for the whale-to-tank emissions. The fuel suppliers are co-responsible for the whale-to-tank emissions. So in order for us as ship owners to be able to commit to sourcing zero-emission fuels, someone has to produce them at scale commercially available at a reasonable pricing. So this, in a nutshell, the uncertainties and some challenges that we face. Of course, there is a non-exhaustive list based on the different ship owners, different ship segments, and so on. Thank you very much for providing me the floor.
Thank you very much, Kostas. And I think from your very quite comprehensive answer, and you even said it was a non-exhaustive list. It's really raising questions at all kinds of levels in the organization. There's one around like, what is the market? How do I do that? And I think that will be specific for different segments and different operators to understand what makes sense. Am I in the tramp taxi thing, or do I have that route? Also, just the practical things of having people monitoring and reporting and doing that more kind of the paperwork aspect of this, which is not something to be underestimated. But I think also what you talk about in terms of the supply and the certification, and how do you, especially for fuels bunkered outside of the EU, how do you ensure that this is actually acceptable, and how do you document that? So I think a lot of both strategic choices to be made, but also quite practical issues to be overcome. And I think that's probably comes with the territory when we're looking at a big transition, but it is not easy. It is complex. And I know, Rose, from your perspective as a fuel supplier, this is not easy or simple either. So what do you see the implications from FuelEU Maritime have on you as a fuel supplier, as a potential stimulant of demand for scalable zero-emission fuels or RFNBOs that you're looking into as part of the hydrogen? What do you see? What are the advantages, and where do you need more?
Thank you, Kasper. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for inviting me on this panel. It's a great opportunity. As a stimulant for zero-emission fuels, we see that FuelEU Maritime is definitely putting a strong step ahead of us. It sets binding targets, defined obliged parties, penalties, and long-term visibility on the target's ambitions. And that is definitely helping in the decision process for new investment, as well as for creating the demand for new products. Now we see that there are 2 points which are weaker, and this is the fact that there is a multiplicity of eligible fuels, together with an absence of a clear sub-target from the start. Let me explain. In the multiplicity of fuels, my understanding is that we can use, or a maritime company can use, biogenic biofuels, they can use RFNBOs, and they can use also recycled carbon fuels. And there's an addition where it says that other fuels could be used provided that they are certified via EU legislation and that there is a greenhouse gas methodology applied. This, to my understanding, is an opening door to low carbon fuels. So it creates a very strong competition in all these fuels in an emerging market, which makes it really more difficult to understand and identify what is the most promising target. So if you link that to the fact that there's no clear sub-target while there is a multiplier, it is for now difficult to understand if this multiplier will have the effective push and be sufficient to enable the RFNBOs to the extent we would like to see them coming in the market in the short term. I would like to add to this context the fact that global maritime companies have potentially different requirements depending on their international routing, and it is not expected that environmental and greenhouse gas conditions are applying everywhere in the depending on the routing. So for us as ENGIE, we are pursuing different options, and we are discussing in the market and with the clients based on 3 fundamental pillars that are well known but always useful to remind. There is obviously, first and foremost, the environmental and greenhouse gas impact. There is the economic impact. It has been mentioned previously. It has to make sense for everyone. And there is the issue of the security of supply. And I would like to point out that this issue of security of supply for RFNBO is linked to renewable electricity, its availability and its intermittency. It is linked to CO2 sourcing, if we consider e-methanol or e-methane. And if we are now looking to the biofuels, it will be considering the biomass sourcing and the volumes available. And finally, but definitely not least, the availability of the sourcing along the maritime corridors. So it is a complex issue. I was very interested to see the modeling, and this is the way we try to work in close relations with our clients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose. And I think one of the interesting things that I think in your intervention is, I think when we talk to ship owners, everyone says, could you just please tell us which will be the fuel of the future so that we can actually just invest in those ships and avoid the risk of having stranded assets. It's interesting to hear also that from a fuel production side, that is actually also the question, what are the molecules that at the end of the day will be demanded by the shipping industry? And I just wanted to ask follow-up question, because I think like one of the things that Faig mentioned was the potential to use contract for difference in this initial phase to have RFNBOs defined as a specific molecule actually being delivered to a ship and used. Do you see some of those support mechanisms, Rose, as one of the ways of overcoming that uncertainty, and at least on a kind of a project level, both for a ship owner and for a fuel supply, to overcome some of that and test out some of the more promising fuels to have that business case? Do you see that as one of the tools that could be used in this time of uncertainty?
Yes, contract for difference can be a very strong and useful tool. It is clearly helping in terms of the security of the investment and the return on the investment. What we've seen up to now in the horizon of the different supporting tools is a variety of tools. It makes it very complex for a developer to understand what they can use, how and when. And if we consider, for example, the IPSI tool, which is an ambitious tool, but has taken a very long time to get some results. So, and it's often one tool is supporting one part of the cost and not the other ones. And contract for difference, as it is being discussed now in relation with the Innovation Fund and the Hydrogen European Bank, is something that we see as really promising, although the detail is often the point to look at, because the way it is structured can have a great difference in terms of its efficiency. Thank you.
No, absolutely. And I think you raised an important point in terms of when we're getting something complex that involves stakeholders across the full value chain, we need to find solutions that take into account all of those different parts of the value chain. So it actually makes sense for all parts. If you only have to design for one part of the value chain and forget the other, you might end up either with a ship without fuel or fuel without a ship. So I think that's a really important message. I think we've lost Ricardo. Hopefully he'll rejoin us. I think there might have been some connection issues, but if he doesn't rejoin, we'll make sure that he hears those points, because I think it's important for them as they think about how to implement these things. But Faig, I think as we heard also in this debate and others, there's this question around demand predictability as a main concern for many fuel suppliers, and in terms of justifying those land-based investments or energy investments. From your study, do you think the FuelEU Maritime helps solve this issue? Does it create that strong demand signal, or where are the gaps?
Thank you, Kasper, and many thanks for Rose for raising that issue. I mean, I can personally very much relate to it because of my background. I used to work for an energy company, and the demand predictability was at the heart of any business model. I think in the grand scheme of things, FuelEU Maritime does create demand predictability for alternative fuels. And it's so important. It's such an essential piece of legislation. What it does not do, it's not very clear what type of fuels it's creating demand for. I think that is the kind of difference. It sets the regulation, refuel aviation, is very simple. It kind of breaks it down into, I want this much, this fuel, this much, this fuel, and so on and so forth. FuelEU does not do that. It kind of creates this goal-based mechanism and allows that fuel choice decision left to the operators. I mean, on the one hand, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it creates flexibility. On the other hand, it creates unpredictability. So I think that is something that the European Union will need to look close into and make certain hard decisions in terms of which fuels are sustainable, scalable, and have the biggest technical potential and cost reduction. And then in the next revision, kind of zoom in further into that. From our perspective, with this study, we wanted to kind of provide some clarity to fuel suppliers like ENGIE and others, that if we assume that ship owners act rationally to reduce their costs while at the same time fully complying with the legislation, taking into account the multiplier, sub-quota, and all other elements, we can see this much demand for different fuels in different periods. So we wanted to contribute to that discussion. We do not have a crystal ball. Again, this is a modeling exercise. This is a deep, complex analysis. But in terms of creating kind of a regulatory driven targets for individual technologies, individual fuels, I think that should be at the heart of the revision next time around. I also want to quickly touch upon the fact that FuelEU Maritime is a European legislation. There's nothing that prevents other countries implementing their own FuelEU Maritime. In fact, there is a proposal in the United States Congress, Clean Shipping Act, and that kind of gets inspiration from the FuelEU Maritime and mostly implemented at the US level. Obviously, it's just a proposal at this stage. And there is another one at the IMO. It's known as the Low GHG Fuel Standard. Its roots is actually coming from the FuelEU Maritime. Unfortunately, media doesn't really pay a lot of attention to that proposal. All the attention is on the carbon pricing MBM, but that piece of legislation, if adopted by the IMO, will have the biggest impact on alternative fuel demand at the global level. So I kind of very much encourage people on this webinar, both on the panel as well as the audience, to be involved in those conversations. Lastly, I want to kind of quickly touch upon what Ricardo said earlier on in terms of the FuelEU Maritime, its ambition, how it's linked to a European Green Deal. It's all correct. It's all correct. The FuelEU Maritime was designed to meet the 2030 and 2050 at the economy level. But one thing we need to also realize is that climate is a moving target. Year on year, we realize that, with the new data, new information from IPCC, that our actions, our knowledge on how much time we had changes. It gets smaller and smaller. For that reason, we need to always bear in mind of that, these new developments, and that's why we kind of wanted to compare EU's IMO proposal with what the EU has just adopted. It doesn't mean that EU's domestic legislation is irrelevant. It just means that until the time you put that legislation into force in practice, the target moved, and we need to move really, really fast with that. And that's why the next revision will be so essential.
Thank you, Faig. And unfortunately, it seems Ricardo has connection issues, because I wanted to put a couple of questions to him related to the interface between the EU and the IMO, because of course those are clearly, and we can also see in the chat that this is an area of interest. I think maybe just to start, and Kostas, you don't need to be into all of the details around the EU proposal at the IMO, but I wanted to ask you in terms of some of the issues you said about kind of the tramping nature and the difficulty in the bulk market to operate ships. Some of them go into the EU, but you don't really know what would be the difference in how you thought about it if a fuel standard, as Faig mentioned, is on the table at the IMO, was adopted at the IMO. What are the things that this would allow Euronav to do that purely having regional regulation might be more difficult? What are your considerations there?
Yeah, first of all, shipping is a global activity, it's a global phenomenon. So the more the global nature of each regulation, the better. Such regulation would allow us to at least be more active regarding fuel sourcing, cleaner fuel sourcing, especially in the hubs that we as Euronav, a tanker company, tend to bunker, at least for time being, and these are beyond EU, mainly beyond EU. So we will be able to engage with fuel suppliers that produce fuel close to the bunkering hubs, ideally, so to minimize, let's say, the emissions from the production unit to the bunkering unit as well. So we will be able to engage more and more with the global fuel suppliers at scale to source either biofuels or zero-emission fuels in next. So this would be, in a nutshell, the let's say differentiator between the EU and the global one, at least pertaining to a company that has less certainty into sailing in EU waters.
Thank you. It makes a lot of sense. And I would pose a similar question to you, Rose, because I think one of the things that we've been seeing in some of the IMO debates is that some of the countries that do have a significant renewable potential to produce this outside of Europe are suddenly also seeing this opportunity for, if shipping starts demanding RFNBOs or hydrogen-derived fuels, that suddenly they might be winners in this. As a company with a global reach, how do you see sourcing and producing hydrogen-derived fuels outside of Europe? And is that something in your work that you see an interest from countries being part of this energy transition that maybe we didn't see 10 years ago?
Yes, we're definitely looking at producing RFNBOs outside of Europe. And I would like to put this question into the context of certification, because this is a point that has been addressed already by the panel, but I would like to really press the button on this topic. There is indeed some opportunities of developing RFNBO fuels where there is large volumes or large availability of renewable electricity. But if we want to be able to use them for Europe, they have to comply with the conditions that we have for Europe. And we see that the current situation in certification, which is the critical point to have the premium for the product and for the maritime companies to comply with their targets, certification is not mature yet. It is linked to voluntary schemes and proof of sustainability when we talk about compliance purposes, and it is linked to guarantees of origin for consumer purposes. And both these aspects are not ready in the EU now for hydrogen and its derivatives. And I would like to give the example linked to not only FuelEU Maritime, but keeping in mind the ETS and the Renewable Energy Directive. How are we going to make sure that the fuel supplier under the Renewable Directive is demonstrating its obligations with proof of sustainability? Then the maritime company under FuelEU Maritime has to demonstrate also something, and it seems that Article 9.2 in FuelEU Maritime is pointing the finger also to proof of sustainability. And under the ETS, what will happen? So how can we, for a same product, have it proven under 3 different policies and by 2 different actors? It's a really real question to us. Can proof of sustainability and guarantees of origin coexist? It's unclear. And we need along the value chain to be able to give those tracking options for the producer, the one who purchases, the one who supplies, and the one who consumes. And it's so important. There's also the fact that, as it has been said, the voluntary schemes are not yet recognized. The delegated acts have been adopted, but there's a large numbers of interpretation issues that are now on the table and needs to be discussed and confirmed with the Commission. And then going back to your question, Kasper, what happens if we produce outside of Europe? Some particular aspects, whether it is concepts such as the bidding zones or an effective CO2 pricing mechanism, these concepts are applying in Europe, but not elsewhere. So how are we going to do that? And these are all the questions we need answers before the market can really start. And just to finish this complex situation, we also have different greenhouse gas calculation methodologies. There's one under RED. There'll be one under the ETS for RFNBO. There's the one that is going to come for low carbon gas under the gas directive. And not the last one, it's the methodology under the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Once the derivatives of hydrogen will be included in the CBAM, yet again, another methodology. And that is horribly complex for actors to understand. Thanks.
Thank you, Rose. And I think this is really, really an important point. And I think we'll make all efforts to also convey this to Ricardo and his team. So there's a need of clarity around what is good enough, and there's a need for consistency across different legislative acts, across different sectors, so we don't end up with different rules for different products. And I think also, Kostas, I think one of the points you raised earlier on in terms of the paperwork that needs to have that logical, so we don't put undue burdens on companies to achieve that common goal. I think that's a really, really important point, in addition to all of the other measures around commercial liability, because we need that. And I think also, Rose, I think you raised this, even just in the context of FuelEU Maritime and the EU regulation on climate, there is an extraterritorial element that needs to be taken into account, even in the absence of global regulations. Very, very important points to move forward. We have about 3 minutes before we need to wrap up. So I'll just ask you to look into your crystal ball, because I know you didn't say you had one, but I'm sure you actually do. How do you see the outcomes of MEPC 80 potentially impacting the EU regulation going forward? So let's pretend that we have an optimistic scenario, so that there is a fuel standard and potential also market-based instrument being at least supported in the division of the. How do you see that impacting what happens at the EU level to ensure that consistency that we've heard is really important for economic actors? What's your take on that?
Thank you, Kasper. So deploying my crystal ball, the July IMO meeting will and the meetings afterwards, they will have hopefully key decisions on 3 main issues, right? The overall targets, 2050 target, hopefully 2040 and 2030 target. Secondly, the development of individual measures to achieve those targets at the global level, the fuel standard, and the contributing impact from the global carbon pricing mechanism. What I see, if we are successful in the global negotiations, and hopefully we will be successful, that's a big hope there. I think the next step for the EU will be to come back and evaluate the levels of ambition between the European legislation and the global legislation, both at the target level, but also individual measure level, and increase, if regardless of what the IMO adopts, I think my crystal ball says that the EU will, in the next legislative cycle, increase the ambition of the European legislation, and perhaps there could be some alignment done between the global fuel standard, if it's adopted, and the European fuel standard, the FuelEU Maritime, and the same goes for the global potential global MBM and the European ETS. I did not see at this stage Europe ever rolling back European legislations at all. I think that's one of the kind of key questions that everybody asking for themselves. I think the European legislation is here to stay. The question is, if the IMO measures reach or exceed the ambition of European legislation, in which case, what will be the course of action for Europe? Is it to lift up its ambition or cancel out the European ambition? In that regard, my answer would be that Europe will revise its ambition upwards, as opposed to rolling back the Fit for 55 legislation.
Thank you very much, Faig. And just to round up, I think one reflection I have on listening to these very, very interesting interventions is that if you came to this seminar and this webinar and thought that you would leave and then everything would be totally crystal clear and you would know what you needed to do, I'm sorry we have disappointed you. I think what I hope we've done is to increase the level of understanding of all of that complexity that needs to be addressed. And I think also, it's clear that just because the legal acts have been adopted, this does not mean that the work of industry stakeholders and others in terms of implementing and providing input so that we have something that is as workable as possible, and to create that clarity also across different domains, as Rose, you really made a very, very, very strong point. There will be more work to be done, and I will just encourage, and I'm sure that Getting to Zero Coalition, we will continue to have a keen eye, but I would also just encourage all of you to provide input, to provide so that we can raise the issues as we see, and hopefully have something workable. And then I think just on the final note, I think we're all praying that MEPC 80 will give a good direction also, and help really set the tone of that global regulation. So as Kostas also, that tramp operators will have more ability to act in commercial viable way. There's a lot of detailed questions in the chat that we didn't have time to answer. I think we will try to gather those and share them back as we share this. And otherwise, I will thank you, our panelists, our speakers, Faig and Alex, for presenting this report. Thank you so much, and thank you for all participants for being here with us today. Feel free to continue sending your questions on what is useful for you to know as we design the next thing. I think one of the issues that was raised in the chat was understanding how the ETS and the funds raised under the ETS can potentially help support shipping decarbonization. We have a dedicated webinar, I think exactly in a week's time, that is dedicating this. So if you are interested in understanding how some of those support mechanisms might actually help make this feasible, please do come join us. I'm sure it will be, like today, raising the level of complexity, and maybe not all of that easy answers, but I think it will be a good discussion to end, because we really need first movers such as you to move forward and start demonstrating that this will work in practice. So I'll just encourage you to sign up. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kasper.